Sophie Carter sat on the cold sidewalk of Los Angeles, her legs crossed, a sign resting in front of her. The sign was simple. Anything helps. God bless. She wasn't used to asking for help, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Sophie had been homeless for months now, surviving on the kindness of strangers, but it was getting harder every day. Her clothes were tattered, her shoes were worn down, and her stomach growled with hunger. She hadn't had a good meal in days. Sophie tried to keep her head up, but the constant battle of trying to survive had taken its toll. She missed her old life, the life where she could sleep in her own bed, have a hot meal whenever she wanted, and draw for hours on end without worrying about where her next meal was coming from. Art had been her passion since she was a little girl, but that seemed like a distant memory now. Life had dealt her some tough blows, losing her parents in a car accident, getting swindled by a fake business deal, and eventually losing everything. Now she was here, on the streets, surrounded by people who walked by without a second glance. She looked up for a moment, watching people hurry by on their busy days. Some were dressed in suits, others in casual clothes, all rushing to get to where they were going. Sophie noticed them, but they didn't notice her. She had become invisible in this busy city, just another face in the crowd, forgotten and overlooked. But then, something changed. A figure stopped in front of her. A man, wearing a large hat and sunglasses. He looked down at her, and for a moment, Sophie didn't recognize him. She saw a pair of brown eyes peering over the top of his sunglasses, studying her. His face was partially hidden, but there was something about him that made her feel like he was different from the others. Maybe it was the way he didn't look away or hurry off, like everyone else did. "Do you need something?" the man asked, his voice calm and steady. Sophie looked up at him, unsure of what to say. She had grown so used to people ignoring her or muttering sorry before walking away. But this man wasn't doing that. He was just standing there, watching her, waiting for her to speak. Just a little help," she replied, her voice soft and tired. "Anything helps." The man took a deep breath and then did something unexpected. Instead of reaching into his pocket for some cash like most people would, he leaned down and took a closer look at the sketchbook resting beside her. Sophie felt a little embarrassed. It wasn't much, just some drawings she had done in her spare time, sketches of the world around her, of people she had met, of scenes she had witnessed during her time on the streets. It wasn't exactly professional, but it was all she had left. "You draw?" he asked, his eyebrows raising in genuine interest. Sophie nodded, surprised that he even noticed. "Yeah, I used to draw a lot, before everything changed." She didn't want to get into the details of her life, how she had ended up here, how she had lost everything. But something about this man made her feel safe enough to share a little bit of her story. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked through the pages of her sketchbook, pausing at one drawing in particular. It was a detailed portrait of a man, his face drawn with incredible care and precision. Sophie had drawn it because the man reminded her of someone famous, though she hadn't realized how much detail she had put into it. "That's really good," the man said, his voice filled with admiration. "Did you draw this from memory?" Sophie nodded again, feeling a small sense of pride. "Yeah, I saw him on the street once. I just couldn't stop drawing him." The man looked at her for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. Then he surprised her again. "You know what? I think you've got something special here." He smiled, a kind and warm smile that seemed to break through the tough exterior Sophie had built over the months of being on the streets. Before she could respond, the man spoke again. "Listen, I think you deserve better than this. How about you come with me? I'll get you something to eat, and we can figure this out together." Sophie blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Did this man really just offer to help her? She had heard similar offers before, but they usually came with empty promises. But there was something about his voice, his calm demeanor, that made her believe he wasn't just offering empty words. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," the man said, his eyes softening. "Come on, let's get you something to eat. We can talk." And just like that, Sophie's life was about to change. She didn't know it yet, but this chance encounter with a stranger, this man who had taken the time to notice her, to look beyond the surface, would be the turning point in her life. Sophie stood up, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was the first time in a long while that someone had offered to help her without expecting anything in return. The man in front of her, still smiling gently, motioned for her to follow him. She hesitated for a moment, glancing around at the busy street, but then she decided to trust him. What did she have to lose? As they walked together, Sophie kept her eyes on the ground, unsure of what to expect. The man's presence was calming, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she didn't feel like she was invisible. There was something different about him. He wasn't just some passerby who would forget her in the next moment. He seemed genuinely interested, and Sophie couldn't help but wonder why. After a few minutes, they reached a nearby cafe. It wasn't fancy, but it looked cozy. Sophie had never been inside a place like this before, at least not in the state she was in now. She hesitated for a moment, feeling self-conscious about her clothes and appearance, but the man simply held the door open for her and motioned her to go inside. "Don't worry," he said with a wink. "The food here is great, and they don't care about how you look." Sophie stepped inside, feeling a bit out of place but grateful for the warm atmosphere. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods filled the air, and for a moment, she almost forgot about her hunger. Almost. Her stomach growled loudly, and she felt embarrassed, but the man just chuckled and sat down at a small table. "Go ahead and order whatever you want," he said casually. "I'll take care of it." Sophie couldn't believe it. She hadn't had a proper meal in what felt like forever, and now here she was, being offered anything she wanted. She glanced at the menu, trying to decide. Everything sounded so good, but her eyes kept returning to the soup of the day. It was a simple dish, but it felt like the comfort she needed. When the waitress arrived, Sophie ordered the soup, feeling a little shy. The man smiled at her and ordered a coffee. As they waited for their food, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about the strange encounter they had just had. She had no idea who this man was, but there was something familiar about him. Maybe it was the way he had looked at her sketchbook or the way he spoke. He seemed so kind, so genuine. "Can I ask you something?" Sophie finally asked, breaking the silence. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." The man leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. He looked thoughtful for a moment before responding. "It's because I see something in you, Sophie. Something more than just the person sitting on the street asking for help." His voice was calm, but there was an intensity to it, like he truly believed in what he was saying. "You have talent, and you've been through a lot. You deserve a chance to show the world what you can do." Sophie stared at him, shocked. How did he know her name? She hadn't told him. He seemed to sense her confusion and smiled. "You wrote it on your sign. Sophie Carter, right?" "Oh, yeah," she muttered, a little embarrassed. She hadn't expected him to notice the small details. "Look," the man continued, "I've been around long enough to know when someone has potential. I can tell that you're more than just the situation you're in right now. And I think you can do something incredible with your art." Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't heard anyone speak to her like this in so long. Most people either ignored her or pitied her, but this man, this stranger, saw her as more than just a homeless girl. He saw the artist within her. She opened her mouth to respond, but the waitress arrived with their food, cutting off her words. Sophie quickly grabbed the spoon and tasted the soup. It was perfect, warm and comforting, just what she needed. As she ate, she glanced at the man across the table, trying to figure him out. He seemed so calm, so confident. He wasn't in a rush, wasn't distracted by his phone or the world outside. He was just there, fully present. Finally, she asked, "So, What happens now? I don't even know what to do with my life anymore. The man smiled again, leaning forward slightly. You take it one step at a time. But first, I want to show you something. He reached into his bag and pulled out something unexpected, a small old-fashioned sketchbook. It wasn't fancy, just a plain notebook, but it looked well used. I've been carrying this around for a while, he said. I think you might like it. I want you to take a look. Sophie took the book and flipped through the pages. To her surprise, it was filled with sketches of various people, drawings of faces and places, all done in an almost unbelievable amount of detail. As she turned the pages, she couldn't help but notice that some of the faces looked familiar. As the meal came to an end, Sophie felt a sense of warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time. She had eaten, but more than that, she had felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in what felt like forever. The man, who still hadn't told her his name, had not only fed her body but also started to fill the empty parts of her heart. She was finishing the last of her soup when the man leaned in, his expression serious but kind. I know it's a lot to take in, Sophie, he said, his voice low and steady. But I want you to understand something. You've been through a lot. I can tell. Sophie put her spoon down and looked at him, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to people acknowledging her pain, much less offering to help. Most of the time, she felt like a ghost, ignored and forgotten. But this man, he saw her, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything might be okay. How do you know so much about me? She asked, her voice quiet. The man smiled, but it wasn't the usual kind of smile. It was soft, thoughtful. It's not just about knowing you, Sophie. It's about recognizing the strength you've carried with you all this time. What you've been through, what you've lost. It hasn't broken you. You're still here, still fighting. Sophie felt a lump in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her like this before. People either looked down on her, pitied her, or simply ignored her. But this man wasn't like that. He didn't see a homeless girl asking for help. He saw a person who had survived, who still had potential, even after everything life had thrown at her. He continued, but I know it hasn't been easy for you. Losing your parents, losing your home, it's a lot for anyone to handle. Sophie's heart tightened as the memories washed over her. The pain of losing her parents was still fresh, even after all these years. They had died in a car crash when she was just 19, leaving her all alone in the world. At first, she thought she could handle it. She had been strong, she told herself. But everything seemed to fall apart after that. Her aunt, who she had gone to live with, had promised to help her. But it wasn't long before Sophie realized that her aunt had her own struggles to deal with, and the kindness Sophie had expected was never there. I thought I could do it on my own, Sophie whispered, her voice shaking slightly. But after my parents died, I didn't know how to keep going. The man listened patiently, never interrupting, just letting her speak. Sophie had never really shared her story with anyone before, not like this. Most of the time, when she told people about her past, they didn't care enough to listen. They either changed the subject or gave her pitying looks, like she was a lost cause. But this man didn't look at her like she was broken. He looked at her like she was someone worth saving. Do you know what happened after that? Sophie continued, her voice growing steadier. I was trying to find a job, trying to make things work, but it felt like I kept hitting wall after wall. Then I met someone who promised to help me with a business idea. He said he could get me out of the mess I was in, but it was all a lie. He took my savings and disappeared, and just like that, everything I had left was gone. That's when I ended up on the streets. The words spilled out of Sophie, and she couldn't stop them. It felt like a weight had been lifted, but also like the floodgates were open, and she was finally admitting to herself how badly she had been hurt. The man gave her a gentle smile, as though he knew exactly what she needed to hear. You've already started, Sophie, by talking about it, by facing it. It's not easy to confront everything that's happened, but you've done it. And that's the first step. You're stronger than you realize. Sophie shook her head, trying to fight back the tears that threatened to fall. I don't feel strong. I feel like I've lost everything. And sometimes I feel like I'll never get out of this. The man placed a hand on the table, just inches away from hers. I understand. But here's the thing. You don't have to do it alone. You've been fighting by yourself for a long time, but you don't have to anymore. You have people who care, people who believe in you. Sophie glanced up at him, her heart racing. She wasn't sure if she could trust him completely yet, but there was something about his words that made her want to believe him. Maybe it was the sincerity in his eyes, or the way he seemed to really understand her. For the first time in so long, Sophie felt a flicker of hope. Just give me a chance, Sophie, the man said, his voice steady. I know it's hard, but I believe you can do this, and I want to help you find a way out of all this. Sophie nodded slowly, unsure of what the future would hold, but feeling a tiny spark of belief that she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, she could start over. After their conversation, the man didn't rush Sophie. He let the silence hang in the air, allowing her time to absorb everything he had said. She sat there, staring at her hands, feeling a mixture of emotions. For the first time in months, she felt like someone truly understood her. But it was also terrifying. What if it was just another empty promise? What if this man would disappear like everyone else? But there was something different about him. Sophie couldn't explain it. She felt a strange sense of trust building up inside her. Maybe it was his calm, reassuring voice, or maybe it was the way he looked at her, like he actually believed in her. The man took a deep breath and broke the silence. Sophie, I know you're not sure about all of this, and that's okay, but I think it's time for you to take a step. I want to help you, and I believe you deserve more than what you've been through. Sophie looked up at him, her heart racing. She wasn't sure what he meant, but she had a feeling that he wasn't talking about just food or shelter. There was something bigger in his words. I know it's a lot to ask, but I'm going to make you an offer, he continued, leaning forward slightly. You don't have to say yes right away, but think about it. I have a place for you to stay, and I want to help you get back on your feet. No one deserves to be alone in the world, and I think you have a future ahead of you if you're willing to take that first step. Sophie felt a lump in her throat. A place to stay. She couldn't even remember the last time she had a home, a place where she felt safe and warm. She had always relied on herself, even when everything was falling apart around her. But this felt like something different. She had been surviving, not living. Maybe it was time to change that. She glanced down at the table, trying to gather her thoughts. You're serious? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded. I wouldn't be saying this if I wasn't. You deserve more than living on the streets. I want to help you get back to doing what you love. Your art. Sophie's eyes widened. Art. She hadn't drawn much in the past few months. She had tried to keep up with her sketchbook, but it had become harder and harder to focus on anything other than survival. But when she thought about it, she realized something. Art was the one thing that had always given her peace. It was her escape from the harshness of the world. You really think I could do something with my art? Sophie asked, her voice shaky but full of hope. The man smiled warmly. I do. I've seen your sketches, Sophie. You have talent, and it's not too late to pursue it. You just need a chance. Sophie felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. She had always dreamed of doing something with her art, but after everything that had happened, it seemed impossible. But now, here was someone telling her that it was possible, that she could actually make a life doing what she loved. The man reached into his bag and pulled out a phone. He handed it to Sophie. I want you to think about it. Here's my number. If you decide you want to take this chance, call me. I'll be waiting. Sophie took the phone, feeling its weight in her hands. For a moment, she just stared at it, unsure of what to do. This could be her chance to start over, to build a future for herself. But it was also a big risk. What if she failed? What if things didn't work out? I don't know, she said, her voice full of uncertainty. I don't want to waste your time. I don't want to disappoint you. The man reached across the table and gently placed a hand on hers. His touch was reassuring, steady. You won't disappoint me, Sophie. And this isn't about wasting time. It's about giving you a real shot. You've already shown me that you have what it takes. I just want to help you bring it out. Sophie looked into his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't alone. She wasn't just a homeless girl struggling to survive. She was someone who had the potential to do something great. Okay, she said finally, her voice firm but full of emotion. I'll think about it. I'll call you. The man's smile widened, and for a moment, Sophie felt like she was being given a second chance to rebuild her life. She had no idea where this would lead, but she knew one thing for sure. Things were finally starting to look different. He stood up and extended his hand to her. Good. I believe in you, Sophie, and I'm not going anywhere. Sophie took his hand, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe this was her chance to finally leave the past behind and step into a brighter future. The next few days were a blur for Sophie. She spent most of her time thinking about the man's offer, about what he had said. His words echoed in her mind. You have a future ahead of you if you're willing to take that first step. Could it really be true? Was this her chance to finally escape the harsh life she had been living? Sophie hadn't called him yet, unsure if she was ready to take the leap. She was still processing everything. It was so much to think about. Could she really trust him? What if this was just another trick? But then she remembered his kindness, how he had listened to her, how he had seen something in her when no one else had. She had to admit that she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that there was still hope for her. That morning, as she sat in her usual spot on the park bench, sketching the scene in front of her, Sophie decided she couldn't keep waiting. She had to make a decision. The man had given her an opportunity she had been dreaming of for so long. This could be her chance to do something with her art, to finally escape the street life. Sophie took a deep breath and pulled the phone from her pocket. She hesitated for a moment before dialing the number he had given her. As the phone rang, her heart pounded in her chest. She was nervous, unsure if she was making the right choice. But deep down, she knew it was time. When the man answered, his voice was calm and warm, just like before. Hello. Sophie, she said, her voice a little shaky but determined. It's Sophie. I'm calling. I want to take that chance. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and then he spoke, his tone filled with approval. I'm glad to hear that, Sophie. I knew you'd come around. You won't regret this. I promise. Sophie felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had made the call. She had taken the first step. It wasn't going to be easy, but it felt right. Where do I go from here? Sophie asked, her voice more confident now. The man gave her directions to a small apartment complex on the other side of town. It wasn't far, but it felt like another world from the park bench, where Sophie had spent so many cold nights. She could hardly believe it. A place to stay, a roof over her head, something she had never taken for granted, and something she desperately needed. Come by whenever you're ready, he said. I'll be waiting for you, and don't worry about anything. You're not in this alone. After hanging up, Sophie took a moment to let the news sink in. She was going to have a place to stay. She was going to be able to work on her art, and maybe, just maybe, she would have a chance at a normal life again. She stood up from the bench and looked around, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She was leaving behind everything she had known, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Sophie made her way to the apartment complex, trying to shake off the nerves that had built up in her chest. As she walked through the front door of the building, she was greeted by a friendly woman who smiled warmly at her. You must be Sophie, the woman said. Come on in. We're happy to have you here. Sophie smiled shyly and stepped inside, her heart beating faster. It was so different from the streets. The building was clean, quiet, and smelled of fresh paint. It felt like a safe haven, a place where she could start fresh. The man was waiting for her inside the apartment. It was small but cozy, with soft lighting and a comfortable couch. The walls were lined with artwork, and Sophie couldn't help but smile when she saw a few pieces that reminded her of her own style. "I thought you might like it here," the man said, seeing the smile on her face. "This could be your space to create, to focus on your art." Sophie felt her heart swell with gratitude. The man showed her to a small corner of the room where there was a table with art supplies. "Take a seat," he said. "I've set up a little area for you to work. You can create whenever you're inspired." Sophie walked over to the table and ran her fingers over the sketchpad and pencils. She hadn't felt this excited in a long time. The idea of creating something again, of getting back into her art, was something she had almost forgotten how to do. The man watched her quietly for a moment, then spoke again. "I know it won't be easy, but I believe in you. You've got what it takes to turn things around." Sophie nodded, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. She wasn't sure how everything would unfold, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was on the right path. As she sat down at the table and picked up the pencil, she realized that this was just the beginning. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to live again. And for the first time, she had someone who believed in her. The days following Sophie's move into the apartment felt like a whirlwind. She had never had so much quiet, so much space to herself. It was strange at first, the peace settling around her like a soft blanket. No more worrying about where she would sleep or what she would eat. No more fear of being alone on the streets. Each morning, she woke up to sunlight streaming through the window, and each evening, she went to bed feeling like she had done something meaningful with her day. The apartment was small, but it felt like home. And the little art space the man had set up for her became her sanctuary. Sophie spent hours there, sketching and drawing. She hadn't realized how much she missed creating. It was like a floodgate had opened, and ideas, feelings, and memories poured out through her pencil. She drew the people she had seen on the streets, the colors of the city, and the peaceful moments she'd found in nature. Every drawing was a reflection of her journey, a journey from pain to hope. One afternoon, as Sophie sat at the table, sketching a picture of a tree she had seen in the park, the man came by to check in on her. He had been busy with his own work, but he always made time to visit her and make sure she was doing well. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, sitting across from her. Sophie looked up, surprised at how much better she felt. "I'm actually doing great. I've been drawing more than I ever thought I would. It's like something clicked inside me." The man smiled. "I'm glad to hear that. I knew this space would be good for you. You're an artist, Sophie. It's who you are." Sophie hesitated for a moment, feeling a bit shy. "I don't know if I'm really that good. I haven't done anything big in a while, and I've never shown my work to anyone." The man nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that. It's hard to put yourself out there, especially when life has knocked you down. But your art is beautiful, Sophie. You have something special." Sophie felt a warmth in her chest at his words. It was the kind of encouragement she hadn't received in years. In fact, she couldn't remember the last time someone had told her she had talent or potential. She had always kept her art to herself, afraid of what others might think. But now, here was someone who saw her for who she truly was. "You should show your work to others," he said, breaking her thoughts. "There are places you can go to display your art. People will appreciate it, I promise you." Sophie felt a flicker of excitement, but also doubt. "You think so?" "I know so," the man said confidently. "You can start small. Maybe a local cafe or an art gallery. It's just about getting your work out there." Sophie's heart raced at the thought. The idea of sharing her art with the world made her nervous, but there was something inside her that said it was time. She couldn't keep her talent hidden forever. This was her chance to take control of her life, to make her dreams a reality. "I'll think about it," Sophie said, a small smile spreading across her face. "Maybe I will try. But I'm still scared, you know." The man smiled back. "That's okay. Fear is part of the process. You don't have to be perfect, Sophie. You just have to take the first step. And I'll be here to support you, every step of the way." Sophie felt a wave of gratitude for him. He wasn't just giving her a place to stay or helping her with her art. He was giving her the courage to believe in herself again. As the weeks passed, Sophie's confidence grew. She continued to fill her sketchbook with new drawings, each one a little more ambitious than the last. The man's words echoed in her mind. "You just have to take the first step." Slowly but surely, she started to think about taking that step. One evening, as she put the finishing touches on a beautiful portrait of a woman sitting under a tree, Sophie realized that she had finally found something she hadn't had in a long time: hope. She had spent so much of her life feeling lost, like she was invisible to the world. But now, through her art, she was starting to see herself again. And for the first time, she didn't just want to survive, she wanted to thrive. The next morning, Sophie made a decision. She was going to take that first step. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew that she had to try, and with the man's encouragement, she would. Sophie took a deep breath and grabbed her favorite piece of art, the portrait of the woman under the tree. She was going to take it to a local cafe that displayed art from local artists. It was a small step, but it was enough to start her journey. She felt a mix of excitement and nerves as she left the apartment and headed out into the world. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the cafe. But she knew this was what she had to do. No more hiding. No more doubts. It was time to show the world what she could do. Sophie walked through the doors of the cafe, clutching her artwork tightly. She felt the weight of it in her hands, not just as a drawing, but as a piece of herself. It was the first time in years that she had felt this nervous and excited at the same time. The idea of showing her work to others, of stepping out from the shadows, felt like a huge leap. But she knew deep down it was the right thing to do. The cafe was cozy, with soft lighting and a warm, inviting atmosphere. There were people scattered around the tables, sipping coffee and talking. On the walls, Sophie noticed several pieces of artwork, paintings, sketches, and photographs. It gave her a sense of hope, as if she belonged here among other artists. She approached the counter, where a young woman with bright red hair was serving drinks. Sophie hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "I was wondering if you'd be interested in displaying some artwork here. I have a piece I'd like to show." The woman looked up, smiling kindly. "Sure. We're always happy to showcase new artists. Let me see your work." Sophie handed over the portrait she had been working on, the one of the woman sitting under the tree. It was a simple piece, but it felt like the most important one she had ever done. The lines and shading captured a sense of calm and peace, something Sophie had longed for. The woman took a moment to look at the artwork, her eyes studying the details. Sophie's heart raced as she waited, unsure of what to expect. Would the woman think it was good enough? Would she just brush it off? "This is beautiful," the woman said finally, lifting her gaze to Sophie. "It's got a lot of emotion in it. I think it would look great here." Sophie couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You really think so?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled again. "Absolutely. You've got a lot of talent. When can we hang it up?" Sophie's heart soared. She had done it. She had taken that first step. And now her artwork was going to be on display for everyone to see. It was the beginning of something new, something exciting. "I can bring it in tomorrow, if that works for you," Sophie said, still feeling a bit overwhelmed. "That sounds perfect. We'll get it up right away," the woman said. "And if you want, we can put a little sign with your name next to it. You know, to give people a chance to learn more about the artist." Sophie smiled, her nerves calming a little. This was happening. "Thank you," Sophie said, feeling a wave of gratitude. I really appreciate this. The woman nodded. You're welcome. It's a pleasure to support new artists. We're looking forward to having your work here. Sophie left the cafe with a feeling she hadn't had in a long time, a feeling of accomplishment. She walked down the street, her heart light, and her thoughts swirling. She had done it. She had put herself out there. And the world hadn't rejected her. In fact, it was welcoming her. That evening, Sophie returned to the apartment and couldn't wait to tell the man what had happened. She found him sitting at the kitchen table, working on his computer. I did it, Sophie exclaimed, unable to hide the excitement in her voice. They're going to display my art at the cafe. The man looked up, his face lighting up with pride. I knew you could do it, Sophie. I'm so proud of you. Sophie sat down at the table, still trying to process everything. It feels unreal. I never thought I'd actually show my work to anyone, let alone have it displayed in a cafe. You took the first step, and that's all that matters, the man said, smiling. And now, who knows what will happen next? Sophie looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. Without his support, without his belief in her, she never would have had the courage to take this step. She had come so far in such a short time. She had moved from a life of fear and uncertainty to a place where she could actually see a future for herself, one where her art was at the center. The next day, Sophie returned to the cafe with her portrait. The woman was there, ready to hang it on the wall. As she stepped back to admire the finished display, Sophie felt a sense of pride wash over her. Her work was there, visible for everyone to see. It wasn't just a picture anymore. It was a symbol of her journey, a reminder that she had the strength to change her life. As people came into the cafe, Sophie noticed them stopping to look at her art. Some smiled, some talked to each other about it, and a few even took pictures. Sophie felt her heart flutter each time someone took an interest. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just surviving. She was living. For the first time in a long time, Sophie felt like she had a place in the world. She had taken a chance, and it had paid off. This was just the beginning, and she was ready to see where it would take her. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of new experiences for Sophie. Her artwork, displayed in the cafe, had become a local talking point. People came in, admired her work, and some even bought pieces. She couldn't believe how quickly everything was changing. The shy girl who had once slept on park benches was now a working artist. It felt like a dream she was living, one she never thought could come true. One afternoon, as Sophie sat in the apartment, sketching a new piece, the phone rang. It was the man, her mentor, the one who had given her the chance she so desperately needed. Hey, Sophie, he said, his voice filled with excitement. I have some good news for you. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. What is it? She asked, eager to hear what he had to say. I've been talking to a few art galleries in the city, he began. They're interested in showcasing your work. They saw the piece at the cafe and want to feature you in their upcoming exhibit. Sophie's hands trembled as she held the phone. Was this real? Was she really going to have her work in a gallery? She could hardly believe it. Are you serious? She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Absolutely, he said, laughing a little. They're really impressed with your talent, Sophie. This is a big step. It's your chance to show your work to a larger audience. Sophie sat back in her chair, stunned. Her artwork had already been seen by so many people, but now it was going to be displayed in a gallery. It felt like everything was happening so fast, but at the same time, it felt like exactly what she was meant to do. After she hung up the phone, Sophie sat quietly for a few moments. She thought back to the dark days on the streets, to the hopelessness she had felt. It seemed like a lifetime ago now. She had come so far, and yet, it still felt like she had just begun. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time in her life, she felt excited to see where it would take her. The next few days were busy. Sophie spent hours preparing for the gallery exhibition. She worked late into the night, perfecting her pieces, making sure they were just right. She wanted to show the world her story, her journey through her art. Each stroke of the pencil, each shading and line was a piece of her past, her struggles and her dreams. When the day of the exhibition arrived, Sophie could hardly contain her excitement. She wore a simple but elegant dress that she had found at a local thrift store. She didn't have much, but it felt nice to dress up for such an important occasion. She looked at herself in the mirror, feeling proud of how far she had come. At the gallery, Sophie was introduced to a crowd of people, other artists, art collectors, and visitors who were there to see the exhibit. She felt nervous, but the excitement of the moment kept her going. People gathered around her artwork, asking questions, admiring the details. Sophie could hardly believe it. She was standing there, surrounded by people who appreciated what she had created. One woman, a local art collector, approached her with a warm smile. "Your work is amazing," she said. "I'd love to know more about your process and how you create these pieces." Sophie smiled shyly but felt a burst of confidence. "Thank you," she said. "I've always loved drawing, but it wasn't until recently that I started to share it with the world. Each piece comes from my experiences and emotions. I guess you could say it's my way of telling my story." The woman nodded, clearly impressed. "Well, you're telling it beautifully. I'd like to keep in touch with you. You've got a lot of potential." Sophie's heart swelled. She had always been afraid of being judged, of not being good enough. But now, people were seeing her for who she truly was, an artist, with something important to share. As the night went on, Sophie continued to meet new people, all of whom were kind and encouraging. She was amazed by how welcoming the art world was. It felt like a place where she could truly belong. Later, as the event came to a close, Sophie stood alone in front of her artwork, looking at it with pride. She thought back to the time when she felt invisible, when she felt like no one would ever see her for what she was capable of. Now, here she was, standing in front of her creations, surrounded by people who appreciated her work. The man found her standing there, a quiet smile on his face. "I knew you could do it," he said, his voice full of pride. Sophie turned to him, her eyes shining. "Thank you. I never could have done this without you." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Sophie. All I did was show you the way. You took the first step, and you've never looked back." Sophie smiled, feeling more grateful than ever. She had found her place in the world. She had found her voice. And now, as she stood in that gallery, she knew that this was just the beginning of a brand new chapter.